all those European countries, the US, Canada, all those countries who dictate how we should handle our wildlife in Africa, those countries are the reason rhino are going to go extinct. And they are going to go extinct because those countries are not going to take the tough decision to vote in favor of how we know we can save the species.
And that'll be on the tombstone.
Yeah, that'll be on the tombstone.
Death by politicians.
Death by politicians.
In other parts of the world
Exactly.
that weren't Africa.
Yeah, death by Western politicians.
How do the two groups look, Alex?
The top one, before the adjusting, about probably 2 MOA, and then the second one, after we adjusted, it's down to roughly probably 1 MOA almost. So it did tighten up the group quite a bit.
That's quite remarkable, actually.
Yeah, no, that looks good. So I think we'll keep going and see how close we can get them.
Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Byron Pace, and this is the first episode of a series of 4 from the Frontlines. This is a series brought to you by Talkie Radios, where I speak to people working every day on the front lines of conservation from around the world. The first 2 episodes, or at least the first 2 episodes, are going to be in Africa, because that's actually where I am right now. I'm currently sitting under a tree, hiding from the midday sun in South Africa, having just been filming in Namibia and Zimbabwe before going on to another project here. And the first conversation is with a really good friend of mine, Alex Oelofse. I've just finished shooting a documentary about his family, and particularly about his mom, Annette Oelofse, who you're going to hear from in a couple of weeks' time in the second installment of this series, along with John Banovich, and Alex is also on that one as well. But I'll tell you more about that in a couple of weeks' time. This podcast, I sat with Alex on the back of his Land Cruiser to record this podcast in a dry riverbed, not very far from his house. And we talked about conservation very generally, but also specifically in Africa. And we talked at great length about rhino conservation and rhino horn trade and what the future for rhinos are in the world. It's a difficult conversation, it's an intriguing conversation, and beyond anything else is a really important one. I would imagine as people are listening to this, you're probably going to have your own opinions and ideas, and I would love to hear from you off the back of this episode. So as I said, this series is brought to you by Talkie Radios. They came to me a couple of weeks ago and said they wanted to support the show, support the work that I've been doing on the podcast. And so I came up with this idea of delivering this series from the front lines. It's exactly the kind of conversations that I love to have. You can get 10% off a set of Talkie Radios if you go to rockytalkie.com/Into the Wilderness, the name of this podcast. I've had them out here, and what you have just heard in the intro was actually Alex and myself doing some range testing just prior to us starting the rhino conservation project, which you're going to hear about in this interview. They have been brilliantly compact, brilliantly rugged. I've broken a lot of gear on this trip already, but I haven't broken these radios. I'm 1 camera down, 1 mic set down, a lapel mic down, a screen down, and I'm sure there's 2 other things that are broken already in the first 3 weeks of being here. But the radios are still going strong. They're made by a team in Denver, a small team in Denver. They only weigh 8 ounces. They have a range of 1 to 5 miles in the mountains and over 25 miles line of sight. They're cold resistant, and the battery will last up to 5 days, even down to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And very importantly for me, they can be charged via USB. If you want to find out more about Talkie Radios, head over to rockytalkie.com and get your 10% off at rockytalkie.com/Into the Wilderness. It has been a really manic couple of weeks out here while I've been filming, along with lots of things going wrong with equipment. I've been bouncing around, but boy, oh boy, do I have some amazing content to share with you all very soon. And I can't wait to get it out there. Lots of filming, lots of recording for the podcast. The Upland series that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago is being put together right now. It's probably the most intensive podcast series I've ever done, for more than 20 interviews that you're going to be hearing over 6 episodes covering some incredibly important topics at home in the UK. But that's all for me for now in the intro, other than to say thank you very much to my Patreon supporters who help make this show possible every 2 weeks, or 2 to 3 weeks, depending on when I have Wi-Fi to upload these things. I've had to travel to an office half an hour away from where I'm actually staying to get this podcast out today, because I've basically had no internet connection for the last 3 weeks. But the top tier Patreon supporters this week include Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of RD Contracting, James Marchington, the guys at South Asia Stalking, Dick Ekstrom, and Mark Zabrowski, and Leslie Cumming. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you so much to every single Patreon supporter who helps me record the kind of shows that I want to do. And that is a lorry reversing somewhere in the distance, and a perfect cue for me to let you jump into this conversation with Alex Oelofse. Okay, done.
Good.
We are recording. We have beer. We have a dog on the back of your Land Cruiser, and it's away. Last time we sat and recorded was 2019, I think.
Yeah, it was the first time you were here.
Yeah. A lot has happened in 4 years.
I can't believe it's just been 4 years. It feels so much longer.
It's gone by in a flash.
It has gone by in a flash.
And now we're sitting here in a dry riverbed on the back of your Land Cruiser, which is literally my favorite place to record a podcast, the back of a Land. The last podcast I recorded in the back of a Land Cruiser, I actually just released on the podcast this last week. And it was sitting with a conservation biologist, Willem, in Mozambique at Mark Haldane's place.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we sat on the back of the cruiser. Tyler was there, and we had all the cheetahs that we were releasing. They were all in the bomas waiting to go out.
Wow, that sounds like a pretty epic place to do a podcast.
On the back of a cruiser in Namibia. So cheers, Alex.
Cheers. Good having you back in Namibia.
We've done quite a lot of things since that first podcast.
Yeah. We've moved in a whirlwind.
And I'm just talking about the stuff that I've been a part of with you, or you and your mom. Elephants to Congo.
Yeah, Elephants to Congo.
We watched the podcast listeners will know, because I've reminded them about that I've been working on this film forever now. But Alex and his family watched the first cut of that like 2 nights ago. Yeah. So when this podcast goes out, we should be within about 2 months of it actually being finished, which is exciting. So that documents the elephant relocation to Congo, which was a pretty epic effort.
Yeah, it was a crazy trip.
Yeah. Just for recount that a little bit, with regard to having elephants here, how they got here in the first place. And why you ended up having to make that decision back then in 2019.
So my dad reintroduced elephants onto our property early 80s, and pretty much we just got to the point where we had so many that we needed to take down numbers, just so that we're not overstocking our property. And we're very fortunate with this opportunity to come up to move elephants to the Congo, to restock a new park, and they basically took a piece of land and were rewilding it, and we felt very fortunate to have a place to take our elephants back into parts of Africa where elephants used to be, and they basically just got pushed out by human encroachment.
People and poaching and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But here specifically, though, I mean, there were no elephants here when your dad and your mom first set this place up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an amazing success story, right? Of the elephants being brought back here in the early days, in the 80s, I think.
Yeah, in the early 80s, and then they a lot of the elephants that came in here originally were actually orphans from culling operations back then.
So what was the reason for that? Why was that happening?
There were areas like the Etosha Park, which were overpopulated.
That's a big national park.
Big national park, and they were overpopulated, and they were actually culling them to keep the numbers down. So they didn't have too many there to overgraze the park. But then with culling operations, every now and then things don't go as planned, and you have orphans coming out of those operations. And so some of those orphans are the ones that my dad then introduced here.
Wow. To create a herd.
To create a new herd.
That's not easy though, is it?
No.
Because I think most people understand that the structure of elephant herds is complicated.
It is. And until they finally form a coherent family group, it takes some time. And we had some ups and downs with young bulls that would go after rhinos and kill rhinos, and so it takes some time for the dominant ones to get to the age where they can take care of their younger ones and actually teach the young animals how to function.
Okay.
So it was. It's a lot of time that went into that, and then when you get to the point where you can then start restocking other areas, and so of course when we restock other areas, we make sure to take family groups and take adult animals.
Because that was the challenge with this relocation, right? That it was actually a family structure that you were trying to take.
Family structure, yeah. So you want to take adult animals with their calves and the whole structure, and of course that makes it a lot harder than if you were just to take younger animals. And yeah, that was a crazy trip of 6 days, 4 days on a boat, and you were with on that whole trip.
It was a long trip. I won't give too many spoilers away because it's all going to be in the film. But yeah, it was the logistics feat of pulling something like that off is quite incredible. But talk a little bit more about the impact of elephants on your area here and what kind of size we're talking about, because you had these new elephant herds built up from the 80s. You now have, was it 45 or 50 elephants, 2019?
Yeah. So I think 2019, before that capture, we had 55, and then we took a bunch out, and we're back up. We have more calves now, so we're back up to about 46 now.
Okay, so you're back kind of almost where you started. But you've had rain since then, because one of the issues that I was beginning to understand when I first started spending time here and documenting stuff was that was year 7 in 2019, I think, of just horrendous droughts. It was
the worst drought in 100 years, and it was 7 years straight where we just didn't get any decent rains. And in 2019, by the end of the drought, we were feeding our animals alfalfa just to keep them alive. We were feeding 7 tons of alfalfa a day, and we kept that going for 8 months straight.
That sounds expensive.
Very expensive, very, very expensive. You just need to try and reduce all your species numbers. So we did live capture on so many species,
protecting habitat. Yeah, that's
exactly,
your focus.
Exactly. And then of course elephants are part of that. But
they're also quite. I've seen this in Botswana, in northern Botswana, and I saw it here back then. And you were pointing it out to me, was they are quite destructive, particularly when it's already suffering.
Yeah, exactly. And they go after the big trees first. So you'll see in an area where it's overpopulated with elephant, all the big trees are gone. They'll, if they can't push a big tree over, they'll actually debark it and eat the bark, and then the tree just dies. It dries out and dies anyway. So you want to keep your elephant numbers. You definitely don't want to be overpopulated with elephant. Otherwise, all of your big trees go, and then after that, they just start working down on other vegetation. And the thing is with elephants, when they're overpopulated in an area, then they destroy the vegetation for all the other animals as well.
Okay, so you have this cascading knock-on effect.
Exactly.
So all the other things you're trying to keep alive.
Yeah, exactly. If you take a riverine area, and they take out all the trees and all the vegetation there.
Like exactly where we're sitting right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Then you lose all the habitat for your small animals, like your duiker and your nyala, Animals that you wouldn't think would be affected by elephants at all, but the elephants, the way they just, take out vegetation, everything down the chain is affected by them. And so that's why it's very important to manage your elephant numbers to take care of all the other species on the property as well.
What other management were you undertaking at that time to just get to the next year?
So of course we were feeding a lot, and then the animals that we could take off by live capture we were catching. But being a drought, there was some species that nobody really wanted. So we were culling certain species as well, just to get the numbers down.
Turning them into meat. Meat products.
Yeah. Before having them die of starvation because of the drought, we'd rather cull them and then process all the meat and make sure that they actually get used for something.
So then you can get some economic return on it, which is probably just going into buying alfalfa to feed all the rest of the game.
Exactly. It was costing us back then, with what the exchange rate was back then, we were running at about $2,000 a day just in food.
Wow. That adds up real quick.
Yeah.
But I think the year after that, you had some rain, or it started to get better.
Yeah, we had in 2020, we had, so the end of 2019 going into 2020, which is our rainy season, we actually had some decent rain again. And then COVID hit.
Of course.
Yeah, so
one problem to the next.
So we went from 7 years of drought being extremely expensive, just trying to keep everything alive, going into a year where there was absolutely nothing coming in because of COVID. But it was quite a lot more relaxing having grazing and not having to worry about the animals and not
Even
having
though you didn't have income
from tourism. Yeah, so but yeah, and then after that, 21 we actually had okay rains as well. So it's been okay since 2019.
How do the economics of conservation in a reserve like this work for you guys? How do you operate?
So when in a reserve like this where everything's privately owned, so in Namibia they call this freehold land, which is basically commercially available land that anybody can buy and then commercially own. And for something like this to operate, you need to make money to keep it going, especially in years of drought where you need to feed your animals. And where you're restocking animals, where you're adding land, where you have to put up fences to keep your boundaries safe. So the land needs to generate money for us to keep these animals on the land. And that's something where people always kind of have they as soon as you start talking about money and conservation, people get scared or offended sometimes if you're talking to, full-on green conservationists. But in Africa, what people don't realize is, people always have this idealistic view of Africa being wide open spaces and plains and everything's just roaming around freely. But there are 1 billion or 1.5 billion people living in Africa. They need to live somewhere. And a lot of the land that was open, wide open spaces back a few hundred years ago, that's been taken over by people with cattle, with agriculture. So you don't really have this idealistic Africa anymore of just having game everywhere. But if people can make a living off of having game on their property, then they'll have game on their property. Whereas if they can't make a living off of it, what reason is there for them to even keep wild animals on their property? And the best example of this is Kenya. So Kenya banned hunting and pretty much the private ownership of game in 1977. And since then, they have lost 85% of their wildlife. So the whole country of Kenya has 15 roan antelope.
Which we just drove past one just on the way here.
Just on our property, we have more than 10 times as many roan antelope as the whole country of Kenya.
It's mind-blowing.
The whole country of Kenya has 51 sable. That means we have 4 times as many sable on one property here, on our property, than the whole country of Kenya. And yet, when you mention Kenya, everybody sees this golden child of Africa.
Yeah, they do, yeah. This kind of mecca destination for seeing wildlife on the continent.
Exactly. But yet Kenya only has wildlife in their parks and their protected areas because for local communities, there's absolutely no reason to keep wild animals on their property because they can't derive an income off of them. So all those animals get replaced with cattle and agriculture. Whereas in Namibia, where you have private ownership of game, and where the government is very pro sustainable utilization, which is actually enshrined in our constitution, and you have legal hunting, 80% of wildlife in Namibia is on private land because you can generate an income of it. And it's very simple. The saying in Africa is, if it pays, it stays. So if you can generate an income off of wildlife, people will keep it and look after them. And that's the biggest problem right now we have in Africa with rhino poaching, because rhinos are just worth nothing alive anymore. Rhinos cost so much to keep alive because of all the anti-poaching efforts you need to go in to keep them alive.
It's colossal.
It's crazy. And then on the black market, rhino horn is worth, if you're looking at kilos, about in Vietnam on the black market, $60,000 per kilogram. And so if you're looking at a big rhino horn, you're looking at anything between 300 and 400,000 US per horn.
And the animal, if you were to buy one from a neighboring farm, what would have that cost you?
To buy a live breeding cow, which is typically your most expensive animal, you could buy one for about 10,000 US.
So the numbers don't make any sense.
So the dead animal is worth 40 times what the live animal is.
And that's why there's rhino poaching in Africa.
That's why and what people don't realize is that this has been going on for years. In 1950, there was 100,000 black rhino. So, and now we have 5,000. So in a space of 70 years, we've lost 95,000 black rhino.
It's hard to compute these numbers.
I mean, 95,000 rhino that have just disappeared. That's the scariest part to me is that so many people out there don't even know about this. They don't know that rhino are going to be extinct in 15 years from now. You mention rhino going extinct, and they look at you, like you have egg on your face. It's like, what do you mean? Like, well, we've lost 95,000 rhino. What do you think is going to happen to the next 5,000? So it's so that's probably the biggest problem, and for us right now, the biggest the biggest challenges for us here, being in Namibia in a dry country, is always droughts and working through droughts. And another one of the biggest challenges we have now is just keeping rhino safe and keeping them alive.
Have you seen an escalation in the last couple of years of issues in poaching around rhinos? I think it's been I feel like it's been fairly well documented, but you're reminding me that I walk in this world all the time with these people, and so I hear this stuff, I get WhatsApp messages. So I know what's going on. I have inside reports out of Kruger, which would make you cry. Yeah. But maybe people don't really know. But in South Africa in particular, it's been horrendous in the last, I don't know, at least decade, probably longer. Yeah. Are you starting to see that bleed over the border here now?
Yeah. Yeah, so
probably because they've run out of rhino in South Africa, have they?
Yeah, exactly. So in 2020, there was a decrease in poaching, but I mean, and then you have people who are hailing this as a decrease in rhino poaching. But the whole world closed down in 2020.
It's very difficult to get about.
Everything went down. I mean, your shipping lanes closed, your air freight closed. Everything stopped. So everything went down in 2020. But then as soon as the world opened back up, everything started going up, including poaching. So last year was actually the worst year for poaching in Namibia in recorded history. And a lot of that is because it's becoming harder to poach rhino in South Africa just because the numbers have gone down so much.
Wow.
I mean, if you look at Kruger Park, according to their numbers in 2010, they had close to 11,000 rhino. Officially now they're saying numbers of around 3,000, which is already a loss of 7,000 rhino.
And I've heard some much different unofficial numbers.
Unofficially, if you talk to the people who actually did the counts, who physically did the counts, they're talking about 700 rhino left. So, I mean, if there's 700 rhino left, then that's a loss of 10,000 rhino. And you know, when we try and solve this problem about poaching, people are always, well, you need better anti-poaching efforts. Well, if you look at Kruger Park, they probably have the best anti-poaching team in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, they have 4 full-time helicopters. They have dogs. They have Belgian Malinois that parachute out of the helicopters to get on poachers' tracks and track them down. It's a constant firefight. I mean, it's a military operation in Kruger Park.
And they still haven't managed.
And they have lost 10,000 rhinos in 10 years.
So it's not the solution. And also in the long term, even if that was able to hold a population static or allow them to increase a bit, that means that forever into eternity, you have to have pretty much a military, highly trained military presence to protect rhinos. Yeah. That doesn't work because eventually the money runs out. Like how does that get paid for? It's expensive.
Exactly. And the thing is you know, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to keep isolated populations of rhino safe and that be what we have for the future? Or are we trying to safeguard rhino so we can grow the population? Are we trying to get back to the point where we can have 100,000 black rhino again?
Hopefully.
You know, so if we are going to solely try and keep rhinos safe by anti-poaching efforts, if we're having a hard time keeping 5,000 black rhino safe with all the anti-poaching efforts we can, what is it going to be like? What operation do we need to launch to try and keep 100,000 rhinos safe? You know, so if this is our goal, to try and grow the populations and get back to what our historic populations were 70 years ago,
we need a new plan.
We need a new plan.
I suppose we can get into that. Maybe before we get into this idea of a new plan and talk in details about something which is quite controversial, I suppose. We're just on the cusp now of a big operation that's happening on your... I'm assuming we can talk about that. Yeah. A big operation that's about to happen on your place over the next couple of weeks. Well, probably a month, I suppose. Yeah. And I'm going to be filming some of that. Yeah. I'm guessing a lot of that was facilitated by the fact you're really increasingly worried about the safety of the rhinos that you have on your reserve. Yeah.
I mean, ideally, if you didn't worry about the safety of your rhinos, you wouldn't want to touch them. You wouldn't mess with them. You'd leave them be. But because should I turn that radio off?
Maybe we should. Yeah. Everybody's getting the updates from your what everybody's doing on your place. They feel like they're here though. You know what's going to happen is someone's going to desperately need you. I suppose they'll still be able to get you on your channel, will they?
No. Well,
you didn't turn it off. Okay, they can do without you for 45 minutes.
Yeah. So I mean, ideally, if you have wild animals ranging in the wild, you don't want to work with them, or you don't want to dart them. You just want to leave them be. But unfortunately, because of rhino poaching being so bad, a lot of people are dehorning their rhino. Mm-hmm. So pretty much those rhino get darted every 2 years. Horn gets cut off.
Because it continually grows.
It continually grows. So the horn, once you dehorn a rhino, it grows back with about 1 kilogram a year.
It's kind of an insane growth rate.
It is. Especially when you think, when it gets longer, it doesn't really seem like it's growing much, but they wear it down so much. But when you cut it down close to the base, it grows about 1 kilogram a year, so about 8 to 10 centimeters a year, which is a lot of horn.
Yeah.
But to try and keep them safe, so we're putting tracking devices in the horn. So you basically dart the rhino, drill a hole into the horn. And so the rhino horn's made of keratin. So it's just like your fingernail. And just like when you're trimming your fingernails, if you cut a rhino's horn off, in the right place that is, or if you drill a hole into it, it doesn't hurt the animal at all.
It's like cutting your fingernails.
Yeah, it's like cutting your fingernails. So we're drilling big holes in the horn and then putting tracking devices in the horn. And then you basically epoxy them in, just to keep a better eye on the rhinos, and
so you'll have like an active map and be able to see where your rhinos are at any point in time.
And the big thing is you'll see if there isn't any movement. So if a rhino isn't moving for a certain period of time, then you get an alert, and then.
So you can be way more efficient with how you use your resources that you have to keep them safe.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of work.
A lot of work, and a lot of money that goes into that. And we got very, very fortunate to have gotten a big grant from the Shikara Safari Club, and then also with a lot of help from the Wildscapes Foundation to be able to make this project a reality. Otherwise, we would have never been able to make it a reality, because it's a lot of money that goes into there, and a lot of you need a professional vet for probably going to be 4 to 5 week program. All the flying hours to dart the animals, all the equipment.
You're going to be in the air a lot in the next 5 weeks.
Yeah. So it's and then parallel to that, you still have to keep your anti-poaching team going. We're looking at growing our anti-poaching team again, and it's just a constant non-stop, and even with all that, you're just waiting for the day when you get that call on the radio that there's a rhino carcass.
Hopefully that never comes, but yeah, you're always waiting for it, anticipating it.
Touch wood, but it's with the amount of money in rhino horn, it's inevitable that it's going to come at some point.
Yeah,
it's just a question of time.
So you have a view on what a potential solution could be. I think it's probably safe to say that you painted a pretty good picture of the efforts that are going on across the continent. Some places more than others where they have the resources, like Kruger Park, the resources that you plow into every day here to keep your rhinos safe. But that's not a long-term solution. What could be a long-term solution? In my mind, we've tried almost everything else.
Yeah. So pretty much when it comes to keeping rhinos safe, there's two schools of thought on how to do it. Or traditionally, people are like, well, you need to do better anti-poaching to keep them alive. Well, we've tried a lot of that, and there's a lot of anti-poaching efforts have gone into a lot of big reserves. But pretty much the only places where where anti-poaching is kept, it hasn't kept poaching out totally, but has kept the biggest populations alive, was in very small areas where rhinos have basically been kept pretty much in captivity.
Yeah.
So you ask yourself, is that what we want? Do we want to keep
future of rhinos?
Yeah, to be kept in captivity just so we can keep them alive? And even then, I mean, you have zoos in Europe where rhino have been poached for their horn.
I remember that.
And I mean, this is in a zoo with permanent security, with CCTV cameras, and rhino get poached. I think there have actually been 3 zoos in Europe that have had rhino poaching incidents. So
there's probably less security in some of those zoos than there is in some places, but yeah, that's crazy that's happened.
Yeah. So anti-poaching is the one way to try and keep rhinos alive. The other, or to try and stop rhino poaching, the other thing that people say is, well, you need to educate the end user.
Okay, so we're primarily talking about Asia here.
Primarily Asia, yeah. So we're a little bit in the Middle East and primarily Asia. So Vietnam and China are the biggest markets. And, well, it's a lot of money's gone into that as well. A lot of there have been very big campaigns to try and keep or to try and educate the end user, that rhino horn has no medicinal value. I mean, Jackie Chan, Yao Ming, they had a huge campaign years ago, and it didn't. Big
billboard. I remember seeing the pictures of big billboards in Shanghai and all the major places.
Yeah, and TV ads, and it didn't change a thing. It did not affect rhino poaching at all. Some people actually argue that it pushed it up.
Yeah.
So,
because it raised awareness of it, I suppose, or as a product.
Yeah. So the media makes rhino horn out to be medicinal, or to be used for medicinal purposes, but it's actually a very big status symbol. Because it's so hard to come by and so expensive, people with a lot of money will buy rhino horn and show off with it to their friends.
Just like the Ferrari parked in your driveway.
Exactly. And so some people argue that because of this whole campaign with Jackie Chan and Yao Ming, that people were like, oh, you're really not allowed to have that. I'm going to show my friends I can have that.
Because it's like power and status.
Yeah, exactly. So what they'll do is, like, a rich businessman will have a rhino horn sitting on his table, and when he has a client come in, he'll actually carve off a little piece, and then he'll either burn it as incense or throw it in their tea, or something like that.
So it has a. So it's deeply ingrained.
They're these special grinding plates, which is basically like a rasp, where you could put a rhino horn in, and then you turn the plate, and you have like little shavings fall through.
You put the whole horn.
Yeah, you basically sit the horn down, and you grind the base off, and this. I mean, this dates back so long, and this is where the cultural aspect comes in. I mean, there's Chinese scripts and texts depicting the use of Chinese horn, or a rhino horn, as libation bowls 2,500 years ago.
So we're talking about culture that goes back longer than some other countries' histories have existed.
Exactly. I mean, this is before Christ that they were using rhino horn. So, okay, it's easy to say you need to educate the end user, but we're looking at a culture that's 2,500, 3,000 years old. And we're looking at a group of people that are cut off from the rest of the world. They
don't have the same access.
They don't have access to the internet we do. They don't see the same news we do. And actually, there have been people have gone into Vietnam, into the Golden Triangle, and they asked the end users, "What do you think about all the rhino poaching?" And they said, "Well, why do you kill them?
What?
We just want the horn. Why do you kill the animals?"
That's fascinating.
And there was a big study done. I can share it with you, where they went in all the way again to the end users, and they did a whole economic study on this, and they found that horn coming off of live rhino and wild rhino is actually more valuable than other horn. People would pay more for that.
Well, that kind of changes the game a little, doesn't it?
Yeah. And so if you're looking at the Chinese middle class is about 350 million people, just the middle class with money to spend. That's the same.
So that's the whole population of the US.
The whole population of the US is the Chinese middle class. And so now, people are saying, well, you need to educate the end user. Try and get 350 million people that are cut off from the rest of the world. Try and get a message to them. I mean, put 10 people in a room and put a controversial subject out there and see if you can get all of 10 people to agree on that, I mean, it's and with it being part of their culture for so long, if you were to go to a Christian and tell them you can't be a Christian anymore because of, whatever reason, do you think that they're going to change their...
Doesn't really work like that.
No. So logistically educating the end user is impossible right now.
Or at the very least, it's a very, very long game.
Yeah.
It's not a next year thing or an even a 10-year time thing.
And we're looking in reality now. We're looking at 10 to 15 years before we've lost all wild rhino.
Okay, so we don't have the time to change the user viewpoint on it.
So in my opinion, and in most people's opinion who work with rhino on the ground, the only way that we're going to save the species is by legalizing the trade in horn. Okay. So you legalize the trade in horn and you take control of the trade. Because right now there is trade. There is so much trade in rhino horn, but it's all illegal. And it's illegal, and we have absolutely no control over it. And we have no control over which animals get poached and which horn gets used. And, so we've been looking, if you take the stats over the last 70 years, it's typically around 1,000 animals, 1,000 rhinos a year that we lose just because of their horn. It's coming down a little bit now just because rhino numbers have been depleted.
It's harder to find them.
Yeah. And yet we sit with so much storage of rhino horn.
From all the dehorning that's been happening for years and years.
Yeah, from all the dehorning, and then also just natural mortalities, and then horn that has been confiscated off of poachers. So if you just take all the horn in southern Africa that's sitting in storage, estimates are it's about 40 tons of horn, which is the same as 8,000 rhinos. So even if we don't talk about dehorning rhino and selling that horn. But if we just use horn that's sitting in stockpiles, horn from rhino that are already dead, and if we're looking at a demand of 1,000 horns a year, we're looking at 8 years that we can sustain the market just by using, horn from stockpiles.
What about the argument that by facilitating a legal market, it could encourage more people to partake in it?
So,
because that's the main argument that gets brought up. That was the argument with the ivory trade, which I should point out is very different, because to take the ivory from an elephant, you have to kill an elephant.
yeah. So
This is your dog. Talking about Belgian Malinois. This one had a bit of a run-in with a warthog the other day, so he's feeling, well, he was feeling sorry for himself. Now he doesn't seem to care. Yeah, so what about that aspect of it?
So again, there's two schools of thought on that. So the one group says as soon as you legalize something, it loses its value because it's easier to come by, and you don't have to go through the whole illegal supply chain.
Yeah. Which partly hikes up the cost of it.
Yeah. So one school of thought is that it'll actually drop the price to about 10,000 US per kilo.
Okay.
And then you have the other side, which says as soon as it becomes legal, everybody's going to want to use it, and the demand's going to go up for it. So if we look at the end user actually really doesn't even know what's going on this side, because at the moment they don't even know about poaching. Yeah. So if it's legal here or illegal on our side, it isn't really going to affect them. But to me, it doesn't really matter if the price goes down or goes up. Mm-hmm. The point of this whole exercise is to save rhino, not to generate money off of the horn. So if it's legalized and the horn and the price of horn goes down, and it comes to the point where it's not worth it for poachers to poach rhino anymore, we're saving rhino.
Because that's the goal, right? It needs to be so easy to access at a price point where why on earth would you go and poach a rhino? Because there's risk involved, like a life and death risk, because you might run into an anti-poaching unit, and it takes a lot of logistics to hide a horn and get it back out to Asia.
And then on the other side, if you have the price going up of horn, well, then you're generating so much more income off of the live animal to keep it alive, and you can put all that back into your anti-poaching efforts. Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing, what we want to achieve is you want the live animal to be worth more than the dead animal.
Yep. So it has to be that way. Yeah. Otherwise, why would they exist?
Exactly. So right now we're sitting at a point where the dead rhino is worth 40 times more than the live rhino. Some big accounting companies have done these calculations, and they've said if rhino horn gets legalized and you take the lifespan of a rhino and the amount of horn that can be generated off of a rhino over its lifespan, the live value of a rhino will go up to about 2 million US.
Wow. That'll make it one of the most expensive animals on the planet.
Yeah. So if you have an animal that, if you keep it alive, is worth 2 million US, I mean, everybody's going to make sure that animal stays alive.
Yeah.
And so the big problem now with rhino is that for local communities in Africa and for people living on the ground, there is absolutely no value to rhino.
In fact, there's a negative value, right? Because you have to keep it alive, you have to spend money.
So for people owning rhino, there's a negative value to rhino. For people living outside of reserves and living in informal settlements in Africa, there is absolutely no purpose to rhino. So I know people that have gone into informal settlements in South Africa and filmed and asked them, done interviews, and like, what do you think about rhino poaching? And they said, well, we don't care about rhino, shoot them all. Because to them, they live outside of a reserve, and millions of dollars is being put into anti-poaching and drones and helicopters and all this, and yet
they're hungry.
They live a few miles outside the reserve, and they're struggling to put food on their tables for their family. So what reason is there? So they don't even care about the poaching or the value of the horn. They just see the rhino as a rich man's pet.
That's Interesting.
So, and until we can get people on the ground to benefit from keeping rhino alive, there's no reason that local communities, and I mean, if you look at Africa, if you look at Namibia, we're sitting with an unemployment rate of close to 40%. So if you can offer a guy 2 years of his salary, or 2 years worth of salary to go and poach a rhino and give you the horn, of course he's going to do it. And, you know, so the only way we're going to, one, keep the species from going extinct, and two, grow the numbers back to what we used to have, is to make it valuable for people living in Africa. So if you take a local community, typically you have 3 to 5 families living on about 10,000 acres, and they are basically just subsistence farming. So they have some cattle and they do a little bit of, they have a few crops, and they basically do this just to feed themselves every year.
Yeah.
So they are not really generating an income at all. At most, they're just feeding themselves every year. And then you have years of drought come in, and you know, they need government bailouts. But if you take 10,000 acres, you can very, very easily give those 3 to 5 families 10 rhinos to look after. And say, for argument's sake, if the trade is legalized and the price falls down to $10,000 a kilo of rhino horn, 10 rhinos, you generate 10 kilos every 20 kilos every 2 years. So for argument's sake, 10 kilos a year. That's 100,000 US a year that those families are generating.
That's a lot of money.
And they can keep their cattle and they can keep their crops. 10 rhinos and 10,000 acres is not even an impact on the vegetation.
And then suddenly you have a middle class.
Yeah, and then you are getting the people living on the ground, generating an income and being able to feed their families by keeping these animals alive. You know, and so typically when people ask you this, or when you talk about legalizing trade, you know, they say, well, it's an endangered species. We can't be doing experiments with this.
We're doing it anyway because we're to keep them alive, or trying to keep them alive by cutting the horns off.
Yeah, exactly. But then you go and look at so many other species. I mean, when was the last time that you heard of a crocodile being poached?
It doesn't happen anymore.
So in the 1800s, crocodiles were being poached. I mean, crocodiles were poached by the thousands for their skins.
Yeah.
And then people started farming crocodiles. And now it's not...
Yeah, we were just at a croc farm the other day.
And I mean, you would not even go through the effort of wanting to poach a crocodile because it's a hassle for the little bit of money you can make off of a crocodile skin. Because there's so many crocodile farms worldwide with the legal trade in crocodile skin and meat. And it's not just crocodiles. I mean, you know, you look at ostriches.
Vicuña.
Yeah, vicuña. Ostriches in the 1700s, people were poaching ostriches.
That I did not know. We even have ostriches in Scotland. There's some ostrich farms in Scotland.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, for ostrich skin, for their feathers, they were poaching ostriches.
Oh, back in the big hat days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then people started farming ostriches. And we had a bunch of ostrich farms here in Namibia. They closed down because there's no value to ostrich anymore. Because you have ostrich farms worldwide. There's so much generation of ostrich skin and meat and feathers that nobody would even think of.
So you're never worried about anybody really jumping over your fence and poaching an ostrich?
No, not at all.
I didn't know that they had been poached so heavily historically.
And, you know, if we look at crocodiles, if we look at ostriches, these are animals that you actually need to kill the animal to consume what you want off of the animal. You need the skin. Whereas with rhino, you keep it alive by just trimming the horn. And, you know, it's when you talk about legalizing the trade and people say, well, it's so sad that you're going to be dehorning them just to put the horn on the market. Well, we're dehorning them anyway now to try and keep them alive. And we're failing at keeping them alive. And the whole point is that we want to try and sustain the market. So the market at the moment is demanding at most 1,000 horns a year. If the demand goes up, say it demands 2,000 horns a year. We want to dehorn just enough rhino to sustain the market and leave all the other rhinos in the wide open spaces be. So if we can grow our numbers back to the tens of thousands and hopefully one day to the hundreds of thousands, if this should happen, if we can legalize the trade, we'd still only be dehorning 2,000 to 4,000 rhino a year. We wouldn't be touching the other rhinos.
But I really do think that as a status symbol, I think it'd lose a lot of its pull.
If it's
Like,
legal
why
to
would,
come
why
by,
would you care?
yeah. If it's legal to come by and somebody can get on a plane, fly over, and go to a shop and buy a piece of rhino horn and fly back, what's the big? You know, it's not hard to come by, and if the price goes down, it's not the status value anymore. So
where's the barrier to this like happening? Because I distinctly remember being in the Eastern Cape with another friend of mine when they opened up the rhino horn trade inside South Africa. But I think it's only ever been inside the country.
It's only
right?
always been domestic trade.
Yeah.
So interesting, in South Africa, the domestic trade used to be open, and then in 2010 they banned the domestic, or the trade in rhino horn domestically in South Africa, and then about 4 years ago they reopened it up again. But this is just domestic trade. So you get countries where the domestic trade of horn is legal, but the international trade of horn is not legal.
And that's where the demand is.
And that's where the demand is. So the international trade of, well, pretty much any endangered species, the animal itself or the product, is governed by CITES. Yep. So CITES is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. And there are 183 countries who are signatories to CITES, and then the European Union gets a vote as well. So you have 184 votes at CITES. So whenever a country who's a signatory to CITES wants to trade something internationally, or change something to the convention, then they can put in an application to CITES, which then gets heard at the CITES Conference of the Parties, which is every 3 years.
COP, as a lot of people know.
Yeah. So COP19, I believe, was the last one we just had, which was in November in Panama. And unfortunately, a bunch of African countries have actually given up on the legal trade ever happening. So the only country to put in an application for legal trade was Eswatini, which used to be Swaziland.
Which Mick Riley is a big
manager.
He's a sort of a driving force behind that. Yeah, I talked to him about it.
So they put in an application for the legalization of international trade in rhino horn from Eswatini, and 85% of the countries who voted against it.
Do you have to? Do they? I wonder if they have to justify why, or it's just a vote.
It's just a vote. So unfortunately, as we sit now, people on the ground who work with trying to keep rhino alive every day, who've, shed their blood, sweat, and tears trying to keep these animals alive, have absolutely no say in the future of rhinos, because the African governments are pro-trade, because we've seen it work. We've seen the private ownership of animals work in Namibia and South Africa. We've seen sable numbers go from 30,000 to 300,000 because there was a market for them. We've seen it with crocodiles, we've seen it with ostriches. And yet, when we come to CITES with a solution to save the species, we're outvoted by all the other countries who don't even have a rhino. There's, of the 183 countries who are signatories to CITES, 11 of those countries have rhino. And only about 3 of those countries actually have big meta-populations. And yet, all these other countries get a say into what happens to our rhino. And unfortunately, when it comes to CITES and people voting at CITES, it's political. It's politicians sitting there. You have the ministers of environment from each country sitting there voting. You have the delegates from U.S. Fish and Wildlife sitting there voting. And it's sad that they don't even take the time to educate themselves on the problems of a topic before they go and vote on that topic. So they have this thing at CITES when it comes to votes on controversial subjects or like the trade in rhino horn, where I think they call it the PP, the precautionary principle, where you would take the precautionary vote, and it's so sad that people would sit by and see a species literally slowly go extinct without just having the guts or the fortitude to make a hard decision and say, we'll vote and support you. You've seen with the northern white rhino.
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably have seen that. The last, was it 2 now? There was 3.
There was 3, so there was 2 females and 1 bull, and the bull died. The bull's name was Sudan. So the northern white rhino is a subspecies of white rhino, and for all intents and purposes, they're extinct.
Functionally extinct.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 females left of that species, and for years and years, you had the decline in the species, and nobody noticed. Nobody, it was never in the news. Nothing, and well, they're extinct. And the same thing's gonna happen to the other rhinos. Populations just keep going down and down and down. Politicians sit at CITES and take the easy vote because they're too scared.
Do you think they're worried about how that? Do you think it comes down to how the fact that they are worried how whatever country they are from, how it will reflect on them when they go home?
Yeah, because the country's politicians take the easy way out. They go for what the NGOs and the animal rights groups and the greenies push for. So when you look at the wildlife economy, you look at consumptive utilization and non-consumptive utilization. So as we were talking about the crocodiles and the ostriches, where you have to kill the animal to consume something off of that animal. With the rhino, we also have consumptive utilization. The difference is the rhino stays alive. Non-consumptive is when you just take a picture of an animal and you don't touch it or you don't interact with it. Yeah. And because the trade in horn of rhino falls under consumptive utilization, all the animal rights groups and all the anti-groups are against it. And unfortunately, as we see with so many other things in this world, in politics, politicians will go for what the vote is that gives them the least backlash. And so because we're talking about consumptive utilization of a rhino, and because all the NGOs are against it, they push the politicians to vote the other way.
If we don't see international trade opening up in rhino horn, do you see a future for rhinos in the world?
No. We'll have a few isolated pockets of rhinos kept in zoos and in fenced-off areas in captivity with amazing amount of security around them.
So it'd be a spectacle.
Yeah.
That'll be a really sad day.
Yeah. That's where we're headed. That's just 2 days ago there was a rhino poaching north of us. It's people ask me what's the hope for rhinos, and there is no hope. And unfortunately, we know legalizing the trade can save the species, but it won't happen because we're governed by politicians and not conservationists. And politicians won't make a change. So rhinos are going to be extinct in 15 years from now.
I hope you're wrong. But it seems like the trajectory that we're on, you might very well be right.
It's a sad message and it's grim, but I think for too long we've been clinging on to the little bit of hope and saying, well, maybe if we do a little more anti-poaching, we can save them. Maybe at some point, people will learn that it's not, that it's not medicine, or it's not worth the status symbol.
We don't have the time.
We don't
there
have
isn't
the
the
time.
luxury of time.
We don't have the time anymore. And unfortunately, sitting on the ground in Africa, looking after rhino, being governed by international countries, thoughts on topics, we still do what we can. I tell people there is no hope, they're going extinct, and they ask me, but why do you keep fighting then? So why do you plant roses in your garden every summer? Is because they're beautiful, even though they wilt in winter. We love these animals and we love seeing them. We want to keep them alive. So we'll try what we can until we've given the last little bit of energy we have. But yet we need to face reality, and the reality is this is not going to change. And the reality is that in 15 years from now, there's not going to be a wild rhino. And the reality is that we can't blame the poacher with people just trying to feed their families. You can't blame somebody for trying to feed their family. And can you really blame the end user? Can you really blame somebody where the use of rhino horn's been part of their culture for 3,000 years and they don't know any better? They don't see the poaching. It's not in the news. They're cut off from the internet. Can you really blame them? In my mind, you can't blame them because they don't know any better. And yet we have this tool to stop poaching and to increase rhino numbers. So who do we blame for the extinction of the species? All those European countries, the US, Canada, all those countries who dictate how we should handle our wildlife in Africa, those countries are the reason rhino are going to go extinct. And they are going to go extinct because those countries are not going to take the tough decision to vote in favor of how we know we can save the species.
And that'll be on the tombstone.
Yeah, that'll be on the tombstone.
Death by politicians.
Death by politicians.
In other parts of the world
Exactly.
that weren't Africa.
Yeah, death by Western politicians. And I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of politicians who do not agree with me at all. And, well, if you don't agree with me, come here and show me different. And if you're a politician listening to me and you don't agree with me, I know you won't come here because you cannot prove me different.
Yeah.
And if you do think you can, accept the challenge. Come here and show us on the ground how you think you can save rhino. And if you can't, then listen to us. Listen to the people on the ground.
It's a powerful message. I don't know how we corral all the politicians who vote in CITES and drag them to Namibia. Maybe that's the answer, if that's possible.
We need to get AI to run politics and make better decisions.
Your place here, and this is kind of linked to when you're talking about consumptive utilization, you run this place so that it stands on its own 2 feet. We touched on this just a little bit right at the beginning of the conversation before we went on this very deep conversation about rhinos. Explain how those mechanisms work here. The thing that blew my mind when I was here a few weeks ago was when I was sitting in your butchery. And I was asking you about the amount of protein that comes through here as a sustainable wild offtake off this land. You have so many pillars that basically make this place work and pay for the wildlife to exist in this landscape.
Exactly. So when you look at what we call the wildlife economy, you have 4 basic pillars. So you have non-consumptive utilization, which is tourism, and then the other 3 pillars are consumptive utilization. So, well, one falls in between the 2. So you have trophy hunting, you have meat production, and then you have live game sales. So live game sale is basically you're not consuming anything off of the animal, but yet you are relocating it to another area. So you are handling the animal. And so what we've learned over the years is if you are going to be self-sustaining and for a reserve to carry itself, you need to have a part in all 4 of those pillars.
You probably realized that over COVID. Or probably reinforced that fact over COVID, right?
Exactly. And so you have a lot of amazing conservation areas and reserves all over Africa that have a lot of outside funding coming in to keep them going. And one thing that we noticed over COVID is that a lot of that funding dried up, because a lot of this funding would come from companies and big businesses, using it as a tax write-off and putting money into that. And yet when you have the whole world shut down, the first thing that companies cut on is money going out. So you had a lot of reserves actually going through a very, very tough time because all their outside funding just dried up. Whereas because we can sustain this whole area just with the money it generates by itself, of course, there was a lot of income that just dried up because we didn't have any tourism or any hunting, yet we still had meat production. So we could still carry the whole place. We didn't have to retrench a single employee, just because we at least had one of those 4 pillars to still stand on. And if we talk about the butchery, I think last time we spoke about it, we came out to about 36 tons of meat that goes through the butchery every year. Yeah. It's a lot of protein that goes.
And that replaces, and the amazing thing about that to me, and it's really important to reinforce this, and I got this from when I was filming last time, I was flying with your mom up in the plane, and she was talking about what this place was like before it was the reserve. Yeah. And she was saying that there was like 3 or maybe 4 species that were here and tiny numbers, and employed a handful of people. Yeah. I don't know how many people you employ now, but I mean, I can count about 50 just going around the place. Is that meat production is both sympathetic to the habitat because it's from species that actually exist in this habitat, but it's also sustainable because next year you can take the same amount off.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at a method of protein production, so typically when you look at protein production, you look at cattle, cows, sheep, goats, or then crops like soybeans. But for either or all those ways of protein production, you are changing nature. You're either planting crops to feed cattle in feedlots, or you're taking everything out and planting soybeans to make tofu. But yet, if we generate protein from wild animals that are adapted and have evolved to naturally survive in this environment without, destroying the environment, where we don't have to plow everything to bits to generate protein. I mean, that is carbon neutral meat. Mm-hmm. That is carbon neutral.
And you're keeping ecosystems in that.
Yeah, the red meat off of a springbuck or any animal that's adapted to survive in this environment is more carbon neutral than any piece of tofu, because it's not destroyed the habitat. There wasn't a bunch of tractors plowing everything. There wasn't herbicides or pesticides, pumped into it. So we've kept the environment natural, and yet we're generating protein off of it.
Your giraffes here is quite a good case study of that, I think, and one that'll probably be a little uncomfortable for people to hear, but also blow their minds. Yeah. Tell me about that, because there's so many giraffe here.
So we have roughly 1,000 giraffe on our property. And of course we need to manage those numbers. Otherwise, just like with the elephant, they'll eat themselves out of their own habitat. They just keep breeding, yeah. Because the giraffe don't really have any natural predators. Every now and then you'll have a lion or a leopard kill a young one, but that's nowhere near the numbers that you typically, or that you need to take out to just to keep a stable population. And of course, every year we look at live sales to try and sell giraffes live, because that's the easiest way to take a large number of animals off. But everybody who has giraffe or wants giraffe already has giraffe, mm-hmm. and because they don't have any natural predators, they just keep breeding.
They have the same problem you have.
Yeah. So in most years, I might be able to sell 6 to 10 giraffe, and nothing. And having 1,000 giraffe on the property, we need to take down about 200 giraffe every year. And so the only other management method we have of that is to cull them and then to process the meat. And when people think of eating giraffe meat, they think, how can you? But it's actually very, very, very good meat.
Good. I can attest to this.
So and it's part of the cycle. Mm-hmm.
And this is southern giraffe.
Yeah.
I'm racking my brains here because I think I remember CITES doing something really dumb a couple of years ago, and they put all of the trade for all of the giraffe species, of which almost all of the others are endangered in some way, and most of those are not huntable as such, in the same. It's just giraffe.
It's
now.
just giraffe. It's all in the same category. So they've become a CITES listed animal. And
It's insane when when there's so many, because there's a lot of southern giraffe.
yeah. And you know, so when getting back on this whole CITES thing, which things that don't make sense about CITES. So giraffe have been CITES listed, so it makes it harder for a trophy giraffe or somebody who hunts it as a trophy to export it to their home country. And yet internally, you know, you still have the same amount of giraffe being shot just to
But you
keep
just have to do
populations
it.
stable.
So you're having revenue, actually, the potential revenue taken unnecessarily because the hunter coming from whatever part of the world would be shooting a giraffe that one of your guys is just going to shoot anyway to feed the photographic tourists.
Exactly. And so while we're on this little CITES topic, the strangest thing is you can legally export a live rhino to China or Vietnam with CITES permits, all legal, but you're not allowed to export the horn.
How does that work?
So in the CITES appendix, it says the live rhino or a trophy rhino you can get CITES permits for. But any specimen of the species is not allowed for export. So the horn classifies as a specimen of the species and not the whole animal.
Okay.
So between 2006 till now, about 150 live white rhino have been exported to China and Vietnam. The last group, I think, that went out, we'll have to double check, was either 2019 or 2021, 10 rhinos that went to Vietnam live.
Why? What are they doing with them?
Well,
I guess we maybe don't know.
so whenever CITES permit is issued, they need to designate what it's for. So it's either for, and there's a bunch of different designations. So usually you see a Z, which means zoo, or in this case, a lot of them have gone out under B, which means breeding.
Huh.
But what do you think they're doing to those rhino? Of course they're dehorning them.
And I wonder if once they're in the country, because that's inside the country, they could just trade in it, domestic trade.
Well, I mean, you have the Golden Triangle in Vietnam, which you can go walk in today and find rhino horn anywhere. So the domestic trade is live and well there. So if you can import rhino to Vietnam, breed them, cut the horn, and sell, why not?
So that actually, I didn't know that. And that completely blows out the water the argument that, well, if you had a legal trade, how could you tell with the illegal stuff? But there's already an internal legal trade from animals that are being kept there. So that's a non-argument now.
No.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And that's what makes this whole CITES thing such a joke, because you can legally export a live rhino, and yet when we ask if we can legally export the horn, then everybody jumps up on their seats and like, no. But yet it's legal to export the whole animal.
Out of the continent that it actually belongs in.
Yeah. So why can't we keep the animals in their natural habitat on the continent they belong on and just give the people who want the horn?
Alex, this is an incredible conversation, and one that I'm sure has got a lot of people thinking. I need to now think really hard, how can this story, beyond putting this interview out, get to a wider audience?
So you did a podcast with, what's his name again, Mayer, about the pangolins?
Oh, Francois, yeah.
Francois, yeah. So the nice thing about CITES is that they have every single CITES permit ever issued is on a database which is publicly accessible. So you can go on CITES trade database and you can go look at all the CITES permits that have been issued.
You want.
Yeah. And the scary part is knowing how endangered pangolins are, to see how much trade in pangolin scales there is with CITES permits that is fully legal.
And they are, by all accounts, the most trafficked mammal in the world.
And yet you can get CITES permits to legally trade in them.
Something doesn't work here.
Oh, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I was when Sarah Roberts was here. You know, we were sitting in front of a screen, going through, and once you start on the CITES database, you just go down a wormhole.
Oh, you just keep
you just keep going, and you check, this species and that species and this and that. And we were sitting there, and we ended up, of course, we first went through all the rhinos, and we ended up with pangolins. And she turned to me and she's like, "What's the point of CITES?" And I'm like, "I don't know." Because you have legal trade in all these endangered species to a certain extent. But then if you want to try and change something that would make it better for the species, everybody's against you.
I feel like I might have found my next documentary.
It's going to be a long one.
Well, Alex, we could carry on talking, and it's very easy for you and I to do that. But we have people arriving for this project, this rhino tracking project, this evening. So I suppose we're probably going to have to call it a day and go and open it, because also the beer's run out. So that, I mean, if that's pretty much the only reason we need to stop the podcast, because the beer has run out. So I think we should wrap this up here. Thank you so much for your time once again.
Thank you for being here again.
I mean, I also don't need much of an excuse to come back to the continent of Africa, but particularly to your amazing place in Namibia. So thank you, and I hopefully over the next, how much longer am I here? Another 8 days. We're going to have a lot of rhino on the ground.
Yeah.
Through darting and chipping. It's going to be an exciting and probably a little stressful, but it always goes well in the end.